And we start with a lecture by Bret Werb. Bret Werb has served as the Music and Sound Collections curator at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. for over 20 years. In other words, since the museum opened. And he has built and organized an archive and reference service used by researchers worldwide. He has programmed the museum's long-running chamber music series, curated its online exhibition, Music of the Holocaust, and produced and annotated 4 CDs of ghetto, camp, and resistance songs. He's contributed to the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, the Oxford Handbook of Holocaust Studies, and other scholarly books and periodicals. Dr. Werb has lectured widely and collaborated on numerous theater, film, recording, and concert projects. And just to illustrate this final point, just a few weeks ago, I was contacted by a professor at one of the University of California campuses because one of her MFA students was tasked with the sound design for a post-Holocaust play that takes place in a town in post-war Poland. And the student was trying to identify and locate music that would be appropriate for the play. So I wrote to Bret and asked him if I might refer the student to him. Not only did Bret agree happily to help, but as it turned out, he himself had been the sound design consultant for the very same play when it made its American debut in Washington, D.C. And now, to discuss of Schmerz and Schmaltz, or some problems in performance of Holocaust songs, Bret Werb.
When I entered this field long ago, my first task was to help build a music collection consisting of print music and recorded sounds for the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Almost immediately, I came across recordings like this. Okay, that's not it either. That's it. Okay, like this, yeah. I think we'll hear it. Can we hear it now? I admit I had mixed feelings about this performance. On the one hand, I didn't care for it, too overwrought for my tastes. On the other hand, I had reason to believe that the song, or rather the LP it appeared on, was a significant production. Dating from the later 1950s, it was probably the first album to appear to feature explicitly Holocaust-related Yiddish repertoire ever issued in Poland. Whatever its musical merits, its very appearance helped advance a long-running Polish-Jewish discourse that continues to unspool to this day. But speaking of tastes, as I just did, I also had mixed feelings about my negative response to this particular arrangement of Unser Städtel brennt, Our Village is Burning, a canonic work of commemoration by the folk composer Mordechai Gebirtig. After all, the museum's research library and archive were meant to serve a far-flung constituency, and visitors with music interests would naturally expect to find a diverse range of styles and genres within the holdings. As the curator, more or less, of this material, it was my duty to be non-judgmental, to assure as much as possible that my predilections and prejudices didn't weigh on the choices made. All this will seem pretty obvious to anyone who's worked in archiving or trained in library science. My point, though, is that the assignment to build a collection of so-called Holocaust music obliged me for the first time, really, to interrogate my own inner tastemaker, particularly regarding Jewish music, Jewish-styled music, and, quote, Holocaust music. So what for me separated a genuinely expressive, heartfelt composition or performance from one that seemed insincere or over the top? Where did I draw the line between honest sentiment and phony sentimentality? I might recoil from certain compositional or and interpretive styles, even from the manner such materials sometimes marketed and packaged. Left one, right one? Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, but really we probably shouldn't go there. No doubt about it, the subjective responses will vary depending on who, where, and when you are. The Supreme Court conceded as much when it defined obscenity as I know it when I see it. Or in the avant-garde singer Kathy Barbarian's formulation, one man's Kunst is another man's kitsch. I hope in this presentation to show how knee-jerk reactions, such as mine, to hot-button genres like Holocaust art might be tempered by insights gained from the study of primary documents, familiarity with historical context, and an informed approach to performing practice. That is, with input from research disciplines that can lay some claim to objectivity. Digression. I almost called this paper Wagner the Jewish ethnographer because, well, Wagner's name seems always to turn up during conferences about the troubled musical past, but mostly because notoriety apart, Wagner's essay, Jewishness and Music, does in fact offer some vague yet intriguingly relatable observations on, specifically, German Jewish synagogue music practice circa 1845. Given the article's more provocative passages and considering its unwholesome resonance over time, these have been generally slighted or overlooked. But while his musings on so-called authentic Jewish music lay bare many misconceptions, these are at least revealing misconceptions, reflecting the perspective of a cultivated, condescending 19th century tribal outsider. Wagner writes, who, for example, had not occasion to become convinced that what goes on at present day in an ordinary synagogue is the merest caricature of church song? Who has not been shocked and held to the spot, partly by horror and partly by a sense of their absurdity, at hearing those gurgling, yodeling, and babbling sounds, confusive of all trace of sense and spirit, and which no intentional caricature could depict so horribly as all appears in fact, and may easily be witnessed going on with the most perfect naivety and earnestness. Continuing along this line somewhat further on, he also remarks on the, quote, impudent nonchalance and indifference of a Jewish congregation during the musical divine service. If possible, set aside the colorful language and give credit where it's due. Wagner did field work. The unapologetic anti-Semite stepped inside a Jewish house of worship and took in a religious service firsthand. He doesn't care for what he hears, of course, and attributes this dislike both to the ossified nature of the ritual and to the bizarre foreign sonorities of the chant singing itself. While we'll never know in meaningful detail the musical goings-on inside Wagner's shul, my take on his ethnographic episode is that he'd overheard a group of men davening, praying in a distinctively Jewish manner, and that their seeming indifference to ensemble rectitude was foremost among his objections. That each congregant prayed at his own pace, pitch, and volume, embellishing the melodies he saw fit, is something the composer must have found maddening. Germanic notions of meter, pulse, intonation, harmonic practice, and part singing were frustrated at every turn. And in place of these churchly proprieties, he encountered an assembly of individuals responding more or less autonomously, more or less in parallel with their fellow worshipers. These elements of style, which nowadays we'd probably refer to as heterophonic textures and non-harmonic melodies, are indeed antithetical to Western classical style. To Wagner and many of his generation, they signified and reified received notions of an eternal, immutable, unassimilable Oriental Jewish character. I'll now leave Wagner to the experts. My best excuse for this digression is that the hyper-individualism bordering on exhibitionism that Wagner found distasteful in his congregants is a distaste I happen to share. Next sound. This plainly American interpretation of the Shoah classic, Unser Städel brennt, recalls the previous example from out of Poland. There is some justification for performing this piece in a martial manner as a fighting song, even with some krächzing thrown in. And in the time remaining, I want to make the case that this approach may be flawed. Here briefly is the same song again, this time with wordless chorus and Wagnerian orchestra as heard over the opening credits to Ulica Graniczna, Border Street, a landmark 1948 Polish film partly set in the Warsaw Ghetto. Music. Roman Palester, the Jewish composer of the score, spent part of the war in hiding not far from the ghetto border street that figures in the film. His choice of Unser Städel brennt as a leitmotif suggests that Gebirtig song had come to symbolize Warsaw's fighting spirit quite soon after the end of the war. The liner note to the Polish LP, written a decade later, reinforces this connection to Warsaw, while also erroneously stating that Gebirtig created his song, quote, within Krakow ghetto's walls weeks before his death. The liner note is purposely misleading, and to understand why it misleads is to understand why the song is often performed as if it were a battle piece. The martial style of the first performance we heard, coincidentally by the Central Artistic Ensemble of the Polish Army, is a relic of the Cold War, echoing a party line or official memory that invariably framed the ghetto uprising within the context of Poland's national struggle against the forces of fascism. And the misinformation in the liner note should be contextualized in light of Polish sensitivity to accusations of complicity on the part of some Poles in the persecution of Jews both during and before the war. Suppression of such references was commonplace during the communist era and, as we've seen, is again a factor in Polish politics. Despite its long association with the Holocaust, however, Unser Städel brennt was in fact first heard a year or more before the German occupation of Poland, and its subject unambiguously was Polish anti-Semitism, something the author saw as perilously on the rise in the mid-1930s. We won't have much time to discuss the songwriter, Mordechai Gebiertig, but a few words on him are necessary to this discussion of musicologically informed performance of Shoah repertoire. Gebiertig was born in Krakow in 1877 and lived in that city his entire life. He was a cabinet maker by trade and by avocation a folk poet and composer whose songs were and remain treasured throughout the Yiddish-speaking world. Gebiertig continued to write during the war, pouring his experiences and emotions into a diary-like sequence of songs and poetry. In June 1942, age 65, he was shot and killed in the Krakow ghetto after refusing to comply with a deportation order. The small notebook containing his wartime writings, hidden and protected by a series of relatives and friends, has fortunately come down to us. Gebiertig couldn't read or write music. He worked out his melodies on one of these, a fujarka, a folk fipple flute, and his musically literate friends would note them down for him. Although he never made a recording, many of his Yiddish theater colleagues did, so we have a fair idea of what his occasional stage performances may have sounded like. But his folk-styled songs were mostly meant for informal gatherings to be learned, passed along, and presented a cappella or with ad-lib accompaniment. Unser Städtel brennt is among Gebiertig's best-known folk songs. And before we hear it again, I must make a quick point about the poem's formal shape, namely that each stanza begins with the line, Sprent, Brüderlich, Sprent, it's burning, brothers, it's burning, and closes with its near repetition, Unser Städtel brennt, our village is burning, or more freely here, while our village burns. I'll now play part of an extraordinary recording that has just turned up in, of all places, Akron, Ohio. This is, I believe, appropriately slower, restrained, and more intimate rendition was recorded by the psychologist David Boder at a displaced persons camp in Henonville near Paris in 1946. The singer is a young woman named Gita Frank. We'll just hear the first minute or two. Yeah. I'd like only to draw attention to two suggestive details about her performance. The first is that in a spoken introduction she recorded for Dr. Boder, which we don't have time to listen to, Ms. Frank recalled that, quote, Gebiertig's daughter sang the song in the cellars among the Jews and summoned them to rebellion, that they should not simply let themselves be slaughtered by the Germans. Frank's account has an anecdotal ring to it, but just conceivably her interpretive style might trace its lineage back to the composer. Secondly, and as some here will have noticed, the text Frank sings includes a variant reading of Gebiertig's lyrics. In place of each stanza's closing phrase, Unser Städtel brennt, our village is burning, she sings Am Yisroel brennt, the Jewish people are burning. It's almost as if, under the circumstances, Gebiertig's Städtel metaphor wasn't explicit enough. Here, by the way, is the last known photograph of Mordechai Gebiertig as attached to a registration form issued by Krakow's German administrators. There's a depixelated close-up. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to produce a recording of Gebiertig's cycle of wartime lyrics, the works preserved in the Krakow Ghetto Notebook. I called it Krakow Ghetto Notebook. Since these texts were nothing less than a personal chronicle of the poet's anguished final years and days, I felt it appropriate to use a solo male voice throughout as a sort of surrogate protagonist. And I was fortunate to interest the talented German-born Yiddish singer and guitarist Daniel Kempen in the project. Kempen and I closely studied the manuscript, which I had photocopied at the YIVO Institute in New York, checking for discrepancies between the handwritten texts and published editions of Gebirtig's poetry. We were also on the alert for any interpretive clues the manuscripts might reveal. The YIVO archive also holds an autographed copy of Unser Städtel brennt, and we naturally chose to preface Gebirtig's cycle of Shoah writings with a performance of this prophetic pre-war song. Here are 2 pages from Gebirtig's manuscript, the first page and the last page on the left side of the screen. As you can see, this is no draft. The script is orderly and very legible, yet also, I think, quite expressive. We took special note of Gebirtig's copious use of exclamation points. There are a total of 12, including 3 groups of double points over the course of the poem's 3 stanzas. I also like to offer for consideration the manuscript's final line, the final recurrence of Unser Städtel brennt. Here, perhaps, contrary to expectations, given the song's often tragic or often heroic readings, the terminal ellipsis suggests not defiance or resistance, but rather a sense of ambivalence or resignation to fate. Although he couldn't, and therefore didn't, suppress his own artistic response to the song, Daniel Kempen kept these interpretive clues in mind when creating his own arrangement. To conclude then, we'll hear it, or as much of it as we can, and feel free to lay into me afterwards for any lapses of good taste. And we can start.
Lässt das Feuer, weil unser Städtel brennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, auf der Säuse, mit Verlegte Hände. Unser Städtel, lässt das Feuer, weil unser Städtel brennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, lässt das Feuer, weil unser Städtel brennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, lässt das Feuer, weil unser Städtel brennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, lässt das Feuer, weil unser Städtel brennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, lässt das Feuer, weil unser Städtel brennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, lässt das Feuer, weil unser Städtel brennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, lässt das Feuer, weil unser Städtel brennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, lässt das Feuer, weil unser Städtel brennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, lässt das Feuer, weil unser Städtel brennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, lässt das Feuer, weil unser Städtel brennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, lässt das Feuer, weil un
And thank you for coming. Any